My name is Eleanor Patterson, 68 years old, and 2 weeks ago I buried James, my husband of 45 years. Yesterday my son Richard drove me from the funeral home, but instead of taking me back to my house, he stopped on a deserted country road. "This is where you get off," he said coldly. "The house and business are mine now." I stood in the swirling dust, clutching my small bag as he drove away without looking back. No phone, no money, no ID. As the silence settled around me, a strange thought surfaced through my panic. I wasn't just alone. I was free. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. My story might just help someone else who's been betrayed by family. I grew up in a small Nebraska town called Millfield, where everyone knew everyone, and life moved as slowly as the corn grew in the surrounding fields. My daddy was the high school math teacher, my mama ran the local library, and I was their only child. They raised me on books and equations and the firm belief that education was the ticket to a bigger life. By 22, I had my teaching degree and was eager to make my mark on the world, even if that world was just one classroom of fourth graders at Millfield Elementary. Then James Patterson came to town. He was 28, confident in a way local boys weren't, with a crisp suit and ambitious plans to open an accounting practice serving the farming communities in our county. We met at the town's annual harvest festival. I was helping at the pie auction, and he outbid everyone for my apple cinnamon creation. "Best investment I'll make in this town," he said with a wink that made my heart flutter in a way I'd never experienced. Our courtship was a whirlwind. 3 months of dates at the only restaurant in town worth its salt, Sunday drives in his shiny car, and long conversations about the future. He painted such a vivid picture of the life we could build together that I couldn't help but get caught up in it. When he proposed in December 1979, I said yes without hesitation. The first signs of James's controlling nature appeared so gradually I barely noticed. A comment about my teaching salary being unnecessary once we were married. A suggestion that the house he bought needed a full-time homemaker. Each little compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, especially when wrapped in his charming smile and promises of a prosperous future. "A man needs to know his wife is focused on supporting his career," he explained as I resigned from my teaching position. "You're so good with people, Eleanor. You'll be the perfect partner for building my business." We moved 30 miles away to Lakewood, not far enough to seem unreasonable, but just far enough that visits to my parents became special occasions rather than regular parts of my week. The distance grew when James began scheduling business meetings on weekends when I'd planned family visits. Richard was born in 1980, just a year after our wedding. James was ecstatic to have a son, his pride evident in the way he paraded our baby boy to clients and colleagues. "My legacy," he called him, even when Richard was too young to understand the weight of those words. As Richard grew, James's rules multiplied. Rules about money, about how the house should be kept, about who I could befriend. The accounting firm began to flourish, and I found myself drawn into working there. Not as a formal employee but as the unpaid administrator who kept everything running smoothly. "Why do you need your name on the business, Eleanor?" "It's all in the family," James would say whenever I brought up official recognition for my work. "Besides, it's better for tax purposes this way." I answered phones, organized files, remembered client preferences, and kept the office functioning while James handled the numbers, and Richard, even as a teenager, was groomed to follow in his father's footsteps. I watched as my son absorbed not just accounting principles but also his father's attitudes. The dismissive tone when speaking to me, the assumption that my thoughts and needs came last. The emotional abuse crept in so quietly I barely recognized it. James was never physically violent, but his criticism was constant, his disapproval a weight I carried everywhere. In public he was charming James Patterson, respected businessman and community leader. At home he was the judge who found me perpetually wanting. "If you just try a little harder, Eleanor," became the refrain of my marriage. I made my small rebellions. Secret phone calls to my parents. A hidden savings account with the tiny amounts I skimmed from grocery money. A friendship with our neighbor Angela that I maintained despite James's disapproval. But mostly, I resigned myself to my role, finding purpose in being Richard's mother and satisfaction in the clients who specifically asked for my help at the office. As decades passed, I became expert at anticipating James's moods and requirements. I knew which topics to avoid, which friends he disapproved of, which meals would please him. I lived in the narrow space he allowed me, convincing myself it was enough. When James's health began declining 5 years ago, his control only tightened. Heart problems made him irritable, and he blamed me for everything from his prescribed diet to the medications he resented taking. Richard, now working as a full partner in the business, followed his father's lead, treating me as something between a servant and a slightly senile relative who needed managing. I told myself this was just how marriages of our generation worked. I reminded myself of the good times, the family vacations when Richard was young, the occasional compliments James gave when particularly pleased with a dinner or how I'd handled a difficult client. I focused on the comfortable home, the financial security, the respect the Patterson name carried in our community. But sometimes, alone in our large house while James worked late or in the quiet early mornings before the household awoke, I'd wonder about the Eleanor who wanted to teach 4th grade, who dreamed of seeing the world beyond Nebraska, who once had opinions and voiced them without fear. I wondered if she still existed somewhere inside me, or if after 45 years of marriage to James Patterson, she had disappeared entirely. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was preparing dinner, chopping carrots for the heart-healthy stew James grudgingly ate these days, when Richard phoned from the office. "Dad collapsed during a client meeting," he said, his voice strangely flat. "They couldn't revive him. He's gone." The knife slipped from my fingers, clattering against the cutting board. Despite James's years of health problems, the actual moment of his death seemed impossible. A heart attack, sudden and final, had taken the man who had been the center of my existence for nearly 5 decades. The following days passed in a blur of arrangements and phone calls. I moved through them in a state of emotional confusion that I couldn't have explained to anyone. Grief, yes, but also a strange, guilty sense of relief that I immediately tried to suppress. The complex tangle of feelings left me numb and disconnected, like I was watching someone else go through the motions of becoming a widow. Richard took charge immediately, in a way that seemed natural to everyone but left me increasingly sidelined in my own home. He contacted the funeral home, decided on service details, and fielded calls from business associates and distant relatives. When I suggested a particular hymn for the service, one that James and I had danced to at our wedding, Richard dismissed it. "Dad wouldn't want anything sentimental," he said firmly. "We're keeping it dignified and brief, the way he handled everything in life." I didn't argue. It seemed easier to let Richard manage things his way, and I told myself he was just processing his grief through action. The funeral home director addressed all questions to my son rather than to me, and I found myself nodding along to decisions about caskets and flowers without really being consulted. The day of the funeral dawned bright and clear, incongruously beautiful for such a somber occasion. I dressed carefully in the black suit James had approved for client appreciation events, applied minimal makeup, and prepared to play my part as the grieving widow. The role felt both familiar and strange, another performance for public consumption while my private feelings remained locked away. The funeral home filled quickly. James had been well known in the community, and the business connections he'd cultivated over decades turned out in force. I sat in the front row, Richard beside me, as people filed past to offer condolences that felt increasingly hollow. James was a pillar of the business community. Such a shrewd mind. He built something truly impressive. Few mentioned our marriage or spoke to me directly about my loss. It was as if my primary identity was still as an extension of James rather than someone experiencing my own grief. Richard's eulogy praised his father's business acumen, his strategic mind, his legacy in the firm. He spoke of lessons learned, of his father's exacting standards and vision. My role in James's life rated exactly 2 sentences. He was supported throughout his career by his wife Eleanor. She gave him the stable home that allowed him to focus on building his success. 45 years reduced to a supporting role in someone else's story. At the reception following the service, I moved automatically through the motions of accepting condolences and thanking people for coming. I found myself stationed near the refreshment table, pouring coffee and serving the cake I'd had no part in selecting, while Richard circulated among the guests, particularly the business associates. It was there, refilling the cream pitcher, that I overheard a conversation that should have prepared me for what was coming. Richard stood with Henry Blackwell, James's attorney for the past 20 years, their heads bent close in discussion. "Everything transferred smoothly, just as your father arranged," Henry said quietly. "The house, the business holdings, all of it. Clean and simple." "And the other matter?" Richard asked. "All taken care of. She has no claim to contest, legally speaking." They moved away before I could hear more, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to catch Richard alone to ask what they'd been discussing, but he remained surrounded by people until the reception ended. That night, alone in the house that had been my home for decades, I tried to make sense of what I'd heard. James and I had never discussed his will or what would happen after his death. Like so many topics in our marriage, financial planning had been his domain, not to be questioned by me. The following morning, Richard arrived early, his expression unreadable. "Pack a bag," he instructed. "Just essentials. Clothes for a week or so." "Why? What's happening?" I asked, confused by the abrupt command. "It's better if you stay with me for a while," he explained, not meeting my eyes. "Until we sort things out." Relief washed over me. Of course, Richard didn't want me alone in the big house while grieving. He was being thoughtful, wanting to take care of me during this difficult transition. I packed quickly, selecting a few comfortable outfits, my medications, a photo album, and some toiletries. The small suitcase seemed inadequate for a week's stay, but I told myself I could always come back for anything I'd forgotten. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, a strange premonition whispering that I might not see it again. I dismissed the thought as grief playing tricks on my mind and settled in for what I assumed would be a short drive to Richard's home in the neighboring town. The familiar landmarks of our town fell away as Richard drove in silence. I watched as we passed the turnoff that would have taken us to his neighborhood of modern homes and manicured lawns. "I thought we were going to your house," I said, confusion creeping into my voice. "Change of plans," Richard replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. We continued driving for nearly an hour, the suburban landscape giving way to farms and then to less cultivated countryside. My unease grew with each passing mile. "Richard, where are we going?" I asked again, unable to keep the worry from my voice. "We need to talk, Mother," he said, the formal address sending a chill through me. Richard hadn't called me Mother since he was a teenager trying to establish his independence. The car slowed as he turned onto a rural route, the pavement rough beneath the tires. After another 10 minutes of increasingly isolated landscape, he pulled onto the shoulder of the road. There were no houses visible, just fields stretching toward distant trees, and a single weathered sign indicating a gas station some 5 miles ahead. Richard turned off the engine and finally turned to face me. His expression held something I'd never seen directed at me before, a cold calculation that transformed his familiar features into those of a stranger. "This is where you get off," he said, his voice as emotionless as if he were discussing the weather. I laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly when his expression didn't change. "What are you talking about?" "Dad left everything to me," he stated flatly. "The house, the business, all financial accounts. Everything." The words didn't make sense at first. I shook my head, struggling to understand. There must be some mistake. We were married for 45 years. James wouldn't. "There's no mistake," Richard cut me off. "Dad and I had an agreement. I would take over everything and you would be taken care of differently." "Taken care of? What does that mean?" My voice sounded distant, as if someone else were speaking. Richard's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. "Dad always said you were the weakness in his life, that your neediness and emotional nature held him back from what he could have achieved. He stayed because of some outdated sense of obligation, but he made sure I wouldn't have the same burden." Each word struck like a physical blow. I struggled to reconcile this version of my marriage with the life I thought I'd lived. Had James really seen me that way all these years? Had he really spoken of me with such contempt to our son? "I have a cousin in Minnesota," Richard continued in the same detached tone. "She runs a facility for elderly women. Nothing fancy but adequate. She's agreed to take you in as a favor to the family. You'll have a room, meals, basic care." "A facility?" I repeated, the word hanging between us. "You want to put me in a nursing home?" I'm only 68. I'm perfectly capable of living independently. Are you? His eyebrows raised in mock surprise. With what money? What skills? You've never held a real job. You've never lived alone. What exactly do you think you're capable of, mother? The contempt in his voice broke through my shock, igniting a spark of anger. I helped build that business. I worked alongside your father for decades. As an unpaid assistant at best. Filing papers and answering phones isn't exactly a career. He shook his head dismissively. This is the plan. This is what Dad wanted. The sooner you accept it, the easier this transition will be. I won't go, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I won't be shipped off to some facility. That house is my home. I have rights. Richard's composed facade cracked slightly, annoyance flashing across his features. You have exactly the rights Dad gave you, which are none. The house was always in his name. The business too. Even your joint accounts were dissolved years ago, though you were too oblivious to notice. He reached across me and opened my door. I have a business to run. Either accept the arrangement with Cousin Mildred, or figure something else out. I don't really care which. Panic rose in my throat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. You can't just leave me here. I don't have anything, not even my purse. You have clothes and your medication. That's more than some people start with. He lifted my small suitcase from the back seat and set it on the gravel beside the car. Make your choice. Call this number when you've decided. He tossed a scrap of paper with a phone number onto my lap. Richard, please, I whispered, tears finally breaking through. I'm your mother. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was nothing. No recognition, no love, not even proper hatred. Just empty indifference. You were Dad's wife. That's all you ever were to me. A background fixture in the life he built. He gestured impatiently toward the open door. Now get out. I have a meeting at 3. Moving as if in a dream, I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling beneath me. The door slammed behind me, and before I could say another word, Richard had pulled back onto the road. I watched, still disbelieving, as the car grew smaller in the distance and finally disappeared around a bend. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic passed on the rural road. No houses stood within view. Just open fields, the distant smudge of trees, and the long, empty road stretching in both directions. I clutched the small suitcase, the piece of paper with the phone number, and tried to breathe through the crushing panic threatening to overwhelm me. 68 years old. Abandoned on a country road with no phone, no money, no identification. Nothing but the clothes I wore and whatever I'd hastily packed in the small bag. I sank down onto my suitcase, tears flowing freely now. How had it come to this? How had I failed to see what was happening in my own family? Had I been so blind, so complicit in my own erasure that I'd never noticed I was just a disposable piece in someone else's life? As the shock began to recede, leaving raw fear in its wake, a strange, almost hysterical thought surfaced. For the first time in 45 years, no one was telling me what to do. No one was watching my every move, judging my choices, controlling my actions. The very totality of my abandonment contained within it an unexpected element. I wasn't just alone. I was free. The realization didn't lessen the terror of my situation, but it sparked something I hadn't felt in decades. Determination. If I was going to survive this betrayal, I would need to find strength I wasn't sure I possessed. I would need to become someone new, someone I might have been if life had taken a different turn all those years ago. Standing up, I wiped my tears, picked up my suitcase, and began walking toward the promised gas station, 5 miles ahead. One step at a time. One foot in front of the other. Toward whatever came next. The 5 miles to the gas station felt like 50. My sensible funeral shoes weren't made for walking on gravel roads, and the afternoon sun beat down relentlessly. The suitcase, though small, grew heavier with each step. Several cars passed, but none stopped for the elderly woman trudging along the roadside. Perhaps they thought I was a vagrant, or perhaps people had simply learned not to get involved in situations they didn't understand. When the gas station finally came into view, a small weathered building with 2 ancient pumps, I nearly wept with relief. A faded sign proclaimed it Hank's Gas and Grocery, and a rusty pickup truck was parked beside the single gas pump. I pushed open the door, a bell jingling overhead, and stepped into the blessedly cool interior. A middle-aged woman looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting from commercial welcome to concern as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Goodness, are you all right?" she asked, coming around the counter. "You look like you've been walking for miles." "I have," I admitted, my voice cracking with thirst and emotion. "I wonder if I might use your telephone?" "Of course, honey," she said, gesturing to an old landline on the wall. "Who do you need to call? Police? Ambulance?" The question stopped me short. Who could I call? I had no close friends, thanks to James's systematic isolation. My parents were long dead. I couldn't even call a taxi without money to pay for it. "I'm not sure," I said honestly, setting down my suitcase. "I'm in a rather difficult situation." Something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of my predicament, because the woman's expression softened further. "I'm Martha," she said. "Why don't you have a seat, and I'll get you some water. Then you can tell me what's happened." That simple kindness from a stranger broke through whatever composure I had left. I sank onto the offered chair and accepted the cool glass of water with trembling hands. Between sips, I told her an abbreviated version of my story, watching her expression change from puzzlement to disbelief to outrage. "Your own son left you on the side of the road?" she repeated, her voice rising in indignation. "After your husband's funeral? What kind of monster does such a thing?" I had no answer. The reality was still too fresh, too surreal to process fully. Martha made a decisive sound and picked up the phone herself. "I'm calling Sheriff Davis. This isn't right." Sheriff Davis turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s who listened to my story with a grave expression. He took notes in a small pad, asked clarifying questions about the house, the will, and whether Richard had physically threatened me. "I'm sorry to say, Mrs. Patterson, but this sounds like a civil matter rather than a criminal one," he finally said. "If the house and accounts were legally your husband's, and he left them to your son, there's not much law enforcement can do. You'd need a lawyer to contest the will or claim your marital rights." "I don't have money for a lawyer," I said, the futility of my situation settling like a stone in my stomach. "I don't even have identification to prove who I am." He nodded sympathetically. "We can help with getting emergency ID at least. And there are legal aid services that might take your case." He handed me a card. "Come by the station tomorrow and we'll start that process." After the sheriff left, Martha locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. "You'll stay with me tonight," she announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "I've got a spare room in back. It's nothing fancy, just storage and a cot, but it's clean and safe." Too exhausted and overwhelmed to protest, I accepted her generosity with murmured thanks. The back room was small but, as promised, clean. The cot had a surprisingly comfortable mattress, and Martha provided fresh linens, a towel, and a new toothbrush still in its package. "Used to keep a few supplies for truckers who got stranded," she explained. "Highway department rerouted the main road 3 years ago, so we don't get many now, but I never throw anything useful away." That night, alone on the narrow cot, the full impact of what had happened finally hit me. The tears came in waves, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to rise from the very core of my being. I cried for the young woman who had given up her dreams for a man who never truly valued her. I cried for the decades of small submissions and quiet erasures. I cried for the mother whose son had grown into a stranger capable of such callous abandonment. But beneath the grief and fear ran something else, a current I barely recognized. Anger. Not the impotent frustration I'd occasionally felt during my marriage, quickly suppressed and hidden away, but righteous fury at the injustice done to me. For perhaps the first time I allowed myself to feel it fully, to acknowledge that I deserved better than what James and Richard had done. By morning something had shifted inside me. The fear remained, but it no longer paralyzed me. I had survived the first 24 hours. I would survive the next. Martha served breakfast, simple but hearty eggs and toast, and introduced me to her sister Susan over coffee. "Susan lives in town," Martha explained. "She's got a spare bedroom in her apartment, if you'd like somewhere to stay while you get things sorted." Susan, a retired school secretary with kind eyes and practical manner, nodded confirmation. It's small, but you're welcome to it for as long as you need. Their matter-of-fact kindness brought fresh tears to my eyes. Why would you help a complete stranger this way? I asked. The sisters exchanged glances. Our mother went through something similar, Susan explained. Not exactly the same, but our father left her with nothing when we were teenagers. She had to rebuild from scratch, and it was neighbors and friends who got her through. We're just passing it forward. The next week passed in a blur of small steps toward rebuilding some semblance of a life. Sheriff Davis helped me get emergency ID by verifying my identity through state records. Susan took me to a thrift store where I acquired a few additional clothing items. Martha's son Jeremy, who worked at the local bank, explained the process for replacing my Social Security card and applying for emergency assistance. I called the number Richard had given me, reaching the cousin he'd mentioned. Her description of the facility confirmed my worst fears. A thinly disguised warehouse for unwanted elderly women with minimal care and no independence. I declined her offer of a place, despite her warning that I was making a grave mistake and would regret refusing family help. Through the local library's free internet access, I discovered that James had indeed systematically removed my name from our financial life over the years. The house had always been in his name alone, a fact I'd never questioned when we purchased it. Our joint bank accounts had been closed 3 years ago, with new accounts created solely in James's name. The business had been restructured as a partnership between James and Richard, with no recognition of my decades of work. Most painfully, I learned that James had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months before his death. The heart attack had merely accelerated the inevitable. He had known he was dying and had methodically arranged to leave me with nothing. It hadn't been a thoughtless oversight or legal technicality. It had been deliberate. There's something very wrong about all this, said Diane, the legal aid lawyer who agreed to look at my case. Even in traditional marriages where everything is in the husband's name, spouses have certain rights. The timing of these financial changes is suspicious, especially given your husband's medical diagnosis. She was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, with a fierce energy that reminded me of my younger self, before James had systematically dimmed my light. Can we fight it? I asked, trying not to hope too much. It won't be easy, she admitted. But there are grounds here for challenging the will and claiming your share of marital assets. The problem is proving your contribution to the business without documentation. A small flame of determination flickered inside me. I may not have documentation, but I have 40 years of knowledge. I know that business inside and out. I know the clients, the systems I created, the filing methods that are still in use. Would that help? Diane smiled, the first genuine expression of optimism I'd seen. It's a start, Mrs. Patterson. It's definitely a start. The first legal step was requesting a welfare check at my former home. Sheriff Davis agreed to accompany one of his deputies, saying he wanted to see Richard's reaction for himself. Your son claimed you left voluntarily to stay with relatives, the sheriff reported back. Said you were struggling with your mental health after your husband's death and needed specialized care. He seemed very convincing, very concerned about your well-being. Did he ask where I was? I couldn't help wondering if Richard had any worry about what had happened to me after abandoning me on that rural road. The sheriff's hesitation told me everything. He didn't ask, I concluded flatly. He did say they've packed up your personal items for when you're feeling better, Sheriff Davis added, though Deputy Miller noticed the garbage bins were particularly full. The image of my possessions, my memories, my life being thrown away like trash, sent a surge of anger through me so powerful it momentarily took my breath away. That same afternoon, I received an unexpected call at Susan's apartment. Mrs. Patterson? This is Angela Winters, your neighbor from Lakewood. The familiar voice brought a rush of emotion. Angela had been one of my few friends, though James had always disapproved of her progressive ideas and limited our interactions. Angela, how did you find me? Small-town gossip, thank goodness. My cousin works at the sheriff's office and mentioned your situation. Is it really true what they're saying? That Richard abandoned you after the funeral. Hearing someone else say it aloud made it both more real and more surreal. Yes, I admitted. It's true. Angela's outrage was both validating and comforting. I knew something was wrong when I saw them emptying the house. I watched them throwing your things away, and I just couldn't stand it. I rescued what I could when they weren't looking. Things I knew were special to you. Hope fluttered in my chest. You saved my things? Photo albums, your mother's recipe box, the quilt your grandmother made, some jewelry I knew James had given you for anniversaries. Not everything, I'm afraid, but the irreplaceable items. I couldn't bear to see them treated that way. Tears welled in my eyes. Angela, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you get your house back and I can return everything properly. This isn't right, Eleanor, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Half the neighborhood is talking about how quickly Richard moved to sell the house and clear out your belongings. The knowledge that people had noticed, that they recognized the injustice, strengthened my resolve. When I met with Diane the following day, I told her about Angela's call and the community reaction. Witness statements about how quickly your son moved to dispose of your belongings could help our case, Diane said thoughtfully. It suggests premeditation, not just inheritance rights. She connected me with a support group for elder abuse victims, a term I initially resisted but came to recognize applied to my situation. The group meetings, held in a community center downtown, introduced me to others who had experienced similar betrayals, though few as dramatic as mine. Financial abuse is the most common form of elder abuse, explained Marion, the group facilitator, and the hardest to prove, especially when it involves family members who have legal access to accounts or property. Through the group, I learned about resources I never knew existed, agencies designed to help seniors navigate legal and financial challenges. I also found emotional support from people who understood the unique pain of family betrayal in ways even the kindest outsider couldn't fully comprehend. A breakthrough came when Diane discovered James's complete medical records. The terminal diagnosis had indeed come 6 months before his death, but there was more. He was on heavy medications that can affect judgment and cognitive function, Diane explained, highlighting sections of the records. We can argue that any legal changes made during this period may have been influenced by his medical condition and medication regime. Or by Richard's manipulation, I added, remembering how my son had increasingly inserted himself between James and me during those final months, insisting on attending medical appointments and handling communications with doctors. Diane nodded grimly. Exactly. And look at this timeline. She laid out a chart showing the dates of major financial changes alongside James's medical treatments. The correlation is suspicious, to say the least. Our case strengthened further when Angela delivered a box of items she'd rescued from my home. Among them was a leather-bound album I'd forgotten about, filled with newspaper clippings and photographs documenting the growth of Patterson Accounting Services over the years. This is gold, Diane exclaimed, carefully turning pages showing me at company events, client testimonials mentioning my contributions, local business award ceremonies where I stood beside James. It establishes your public role in the business, even without formal titles or salary. The most unexpected support came from Martin Weber, a longtime client of the firm who recognized me at the bus stop one rainy afternoon. He insisted on giving me a ride and was appalled to hear what had happened. But you were Patterson Accounting, he said incredulously. James was good with numbers, sure, but you were the one who remembered everything about our businesses, our families. You created that filing system they still use, the one that lets them find 30 years of records in minutes. You trained all the office staff. Everyone knew that. His indignation turned to determination. I'll testify to that effect, Mrs. Patterson. And I bet other longtime clients would too. This isn't right. True to his word, Martin reached out to other business owners, gathering statements about my role in the firm's success. Several offered to speak directly to the court if needed, their loyalty to me outweighing any concern about alienating Richard. With mounting evidence and growing community support, Diane filed our legal challenge, contesting the will and claiming my rightful share of both the marital assets and the business I had helped build. The filing made local news, a small article in the town paper that nevertheless sent ripples through the community. Richard's response came swiftly, not through legal channels but through Martha, who arrived at Susan's apartment looking troubled. A man came to the gas station looking for you, she said. Didn't give his name, but said he was representing your family's interests. Said you were unwell and needed to come home for proper care. When I said I didn't know where you were staying, he suggested it would be better for everyone if you dropped this misunderstanding before things got complicated. The thinly veiled threat only strengthened my resolve. Did he frighten you? I asked, concerned for the woman who had shown me such kindness. Martha snorted. Takes more than some city boy in an expensive suit to scare me. I've been running that station alone for 15 years. But I thought you should know they're looking for you. The intimidation attempts continued. Susan received similar visits. Diane found her office door vandalized. Sheriff Davis reported that inquiries had been made about my whereabouts from legal representatives who wouldn't identify their clients. They're trying to scare us off, Diane said during our next meeting. Which tells me they're worried. If your claims were truly baseless, they'd let the court dismiss them. This pressure suggests they know we have a case. Despite the intimidation, or perhaps because of it, my determination only grew. Each attempt to frighten me into submission reminded me too much of James's controlling tactics, the ways he had diminished and isolated me over decades. I was done being controlled, done being erased. The day we received notice of our first court date, I treated myself to a haircut at an inexpensive salon. The stylist, a young woman with gentle hands and creative flair, suggested a shorter, more modern style that framed my face and added volume to my thinning hair. It takes years off, she said, spinning the chair so I could see the final result. The woman in the mirror surprised me. Without the heavy, outdated style James had preferred, my features looked stronger, more defined. I looked like someone with opinions and purpose. I looked like someone who might fight back and win. When I arrived at the courthouse for our preliminary hearing, wearing a borrowed suit from Susan and my new haircut, I caught a glimpse of Richard's face as he spotted me across the lobby. For just a moment, his confident mask slipped, revealing naked shock at my transformation. In that instant, I knew that whatever happened legally, I had already begun to reclaim my life in ways he hadn't thought possible. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened carefully to both sides' initial arguments. Richard's attorney painted me as a mentally unstable widow making unreasonable claims, while Diane presented evidence of my decades of uncompensated work and the suspicious timing of the financial changes. Mrs. Patterson is not seeking to overturn her late husband's entire will, Diane explained. She merely asks for her fair share of the assets she helped build over a 45-year marriage, and recognition of her contributions to a business that would not exist in its current form without her work. To my surprise, the judge granted our request for temporary support from the estate while the case proceeded. Based on the evidence presented, there is sufficient question about Mrs. Patterson's rightful share to warrant maintenance payments until final determination, she stated. The court orders monthly payments of living expenses to be drawn from the estate, and Mrs. Patterson is to have access to retrieve her personal belongings from the marital home, supervised if necessary. It wasn't a final victory, but it was the first official recognition that my claims had merit. As we left the courtroom, I felt a strange lightness, as if some invisible weight had begun to lift from my shoulders. This is just the beginning, Diane cautioned as we descended the courthouse steps. They'll fight hard, and it could take months to resolve. I have time, I replied, lifting my face to the sun. For the first time in decades, my time is my own. The monthly support payments, though modest, provided enough security for me to rent a small efficiency apartment. After weeks of imposing on Susan's generosity, having my own space felt like an extraordinary luxury, even if that space was just a single room with a kitchenette and tiny bathroom. It's perfect, I told Susan as she helped me move in my few possessions. It's mine. The blank walls and sparse furnishings represented possibility, rather than emptiness. With no one else's preferences to consider, I chose a cheerful yellow comforter for the fold-out sofa bed, and hung a watercolor of wildflowers I'd found at a thrift store. Small decisions, but mine alone. Finding employment at 68, with no formal work history and limited computer skills, proved challenging. After several rejections that politely suggested I was overqualified, a kind euphemism for too old, the local library offered me a part-time position as a circulation assistant. Your organizational experience is exactly what we need, said Mrs. Hendricks, the head librarian. "And your people skills are excellent. The filing system you described using at the accounting firm is quite similar to our catalog management. The 20 hours a week provided supplemental income and, more importantly, structure and purpose. I learned the library's computer system, developed relationships with regular patrons, and found satisfaction in the quiet, orderly environment that valued precision and memory, skills I'd honed over decades of unpaid work." "You're a natural at this," Mrs. Hendricks commented after I reorganized the reference section during a slow afternoon. "Have you considered taking some of the free computer classes we offer? With your organizational abilities, you could move into database management." The suggestion that I might have skills worth developing, a professional future despite my age, was both startling and exhilarating. I enrolled in the basic computing course, finding myself the oldest student by several decades, but welcomed nevertheless. The young instructor, Jacob, showed remarkable patience as I navigated the unfamiliar technology. "You're picking this up faster than most," he encouraged after I successfully created my first spreadsheet. "You already understand the logic behind it, which is the hardest part for most beginners." Each small mastery built my confidence. Email, internet searching, word processing. Skills that had seemed beyond my reach became tools I could use independently. I created a simple resume, opened my first personal email account, and began exploring online resources for seniors starting over. Through the library's community bulletin board, I discovered a support group specifically for women rebuilding their lives after divorce or widowhood. Unlike the elder abuse group, which focused on healing from trauma, this circle emphasized practical skills and future planning. "I was married for 32 years, shared Gloria, a stylish woman in her early 60s during my first meeting. "When Frank left me for his secretary, I didn't even know how to pay the electric bill. He'd handled everything financial. 2 years later, I'm running my own bookkeeping service for small businesses." Her story and others like it expanded my sense of what might be possible. These women had reinvented themselves in their 50s, 60s, even 70s. They'd learned new skills, found new passions, built new connections. They spoke of their previous lives with clarity rather than bitterness, acknowledging both what they'd lost and what they'd gained in independence. Through Gloria, I reconnected with a skill I'd nearly forgotten. Before meeting James, I'd loved painting, spending weekends capturing Nebraska landscapes in watercolors. Gloria hosted monthly art gatherings in her home, casual sessions where women brought projects to work on while sharing conversation and support. "Bring anything creative," she encouraged when inviting me. "Knitting, sketching, whatever you enjoy." I arrived empty-handed, planning just to observe, but Gloria set a small watercolor kit and paper before me. "Just play," she suggested. "No pressure." The feel of the brush in my hand awakened muscle memory from half a century earlier. The colors blended and flowed, creating a simple sunset that captured the view from my new apartment window. It wasn't technically impressive, but the act of creation itself filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was empty. "You have a good eye," commented Rita, a retired art teacher among the group. "Your composition is naturally balanced. Have you painted before?" "A lifetime ago," I admitted. "Before I was married." "Well, you should start again," she said definitively. Talent doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right time to reemerge. I began painting regularly, small watercolors that captured moments of my new life. The library's reading garden, the bus stop where I waited each morning, the coffee shop where our support group sometimes met. Rita offered gentle guidance, suggesting techniques and materials, encouraging me to exhibit in the library's community art space. "Just a few pieces," she urged. "Let people see what you've created." The thought terrified and thrilled me equally. James had dismissed my early artistic interests as impractical hobbies better set aside for more important work, namely supporting his career. The idea of publicly claiming this part of myself felt both rebellious and right. The small exhibition, just 6 watercolors displayed in the library's community room, led to an unexpected commission from a patron who wanted a painting of her historic home as an anniversary gift. The modest payment validated my efforts in a way simple praise couldn't. Someone valued my work enough to exchange money for it, a fundamental recognition I'd been denied in my married life. As summer turned to fall, my legal case continued its slow progress through the court system. Richard's attorneys filed motion after motion, each designed to delay proceedings and increase costs, hoping to exhaust my resources and resolve. They didn't realize that each delay only strengthened my new life, giving me time to develop skills and connections independent of the case's outcome. The most unexpected development came in the form of a letter that arrived at my apartment in early October, 6 months after James's funeral. The return address showed a town in Arizona I didn't recognize, but the name made my heart skip. Margaret Patterson. Margaret was James's younger sister, estranged from the family for decades after a bitter argument with her brother. James had forbidden any contact with her, describing her as unstable and vindictive, though he'd never specified what caused their falling out. I'd always suspected it had something to do with their parents' estate, but James had shut down any questions on the subject. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Dear Eleanor, the letter began in elegant handwriting. You won't remember me, as we met only once at your wedding, but I am James's sister Margaret. News of your situation has reached me through mutual connections, and I felt compelled to write. What my brother and nephew have done to you is unconscionable, though sadly not surprising to me. James did something similar to me 30 years ago, using legal maneuvering to deny me my share of our parents' estate. The letter continued, detailing patterns of financial manipulation stretching back to James's early adulthood. Margaret had documentation, she explained, of accounts James had hidden during their parents' final years, funds he'd redirected to himself that should have been jointly inherited. I've spent decades rebuilding my life, much as you are doing now, she wrote. I never pursued legal action, lacking the resources and evidence. But I've kept records of everything, and if they might help your case against Richard, who seems to have learned his father's worst traits, they are yours to use. Included with the letter were copies of financial statements, letters between James and family attorneys, and a detailed timeline of transactions that established a clear pattern of deception. It was as if Margaret had provided the missing puzzle piece that completed the picture of James's character that I'd only glimpsed in fragments during our marriage. I called Diane immediately. This changes everything, she said after reviewing the documents. It establishes a pattern of behavior that supports our claims about the suspicious timing of the changes to your financial arrangements. And it gives us leverage we didn't have before. True to Diane's prediction, Richard's attorney requested a meeting within days of our submitting Margaret's evidence to the court. The settlement offer they presented was still insultingly inadequate, offering me a small lump sum in exchange for dropping all claims. My client is prepared to be generous given Mrs. Patterson's age and situation, the attorney stated in the bland, professional tone that barely disguised the implied insult. This offer would provide for her basic needs without the stress and uncertainty of continued litigation. I looked at the figure on the paper, then at Richard sitting silently beside his attorney, his expression carefully composed to reveal nothing. In that moment I saw clearly the calculation behind the offer. They thought I was desperate, worn down, willing to accept any resolution that provided immediate security. The Eleanor of a year ago might have done exactly that. This isn't generosity, I said quietly. It's an attempt to buy my silence cheaply. I decline. The flash of surprise in Richard's eyes was worth whatever risk I took in rejecting the offer. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me, not as his father's appendage or a problem to be managed, but as an individual with her own strength and resolve. Diane backed my decision completely. We believe in the merits of our case, she informed Richard's attorney, and we're prepared to see it through to judgment. As we left the meeting, Diane gave my hand a supportive squeeze. That took courage, she said. They'll come back with a better offer now that they know you won't fold easily. She was right. Within 2 weeks, Richard's team proposed a significantly improved settlement, one that included a modest house from James's investment properties, a percentage of the business value, and restoration of a retirement account that would provide sustainable income. It's not everything we might get if we continued to trial, Diane advised, but it's a reasonable outcome that gives you immediate security and puts this behind you. After careful consideration, I accepted. While part of me wanted the public vindication of a trial judgment, the practical reality was that a guaranteed settlement now offered more value than a potentially larger judgment months or years in the future. I had learned from James's controlling patterns that sometimes freedom meant making pragmatic choices that served your long-term interests. The day I signed the settlement papers, I expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, I felt something quieter and more profound. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a victory over my past, but a foundation for my future. The small house that came to me through the settlement couldn't have been more different from the imposing colonial James and I had shared. A modest 2-bedroom bungalow in a mixed neighborhood of retirees and young families, it had a neglected garden, outdated kitchen, and charming bay window in the living room that caught the morning light perfectly. "It needs work," the property manager warned when handing over the keys. "It's been a rental for years." "Perfect," I replied. "I need a project." For the first time in my adult life, I could choose colors for walls, arrange furniture according to my preference, and decorate without considering anyone else's tastes. I painted the living room a soft sage green that James would have hated, installed bookshelves for my growing collection of library sale finds, and splurged on comfortable reading chair positioned to catch that morning light. With help from Gloria's husband Ted, who enjoyed retirement handyman projects, I learned basic home repair skills. Changing light fixtures, patching drywall, installing shelving, small competencies that represented enormous shifts in my self-perception. "You're a natural," Ted encouraged after I successfully replaced a leaky faucet. "Most people get intimidated by plumbing, but you just tackle it step by step." The garden became my greatest joy and challenge. Years of neglect had left it overgrown and chaotic, but beneath the weeds lay good bones, perennial plants struggling to survive. I spent weekends clearing, pruning, and replanting, creating outdoor rooms with distinct purposes. A vegetable patch that yielded summer tomatoes and herbs. A seating area where I could paint or read. A border of native flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The physical work was therapeutic, allowing me to process emotions as I literally rooted myself in new ground. As I reclaimed the garden, I reclaimed pieces of myself that had been buried during my marriage, interests and abilities I'd set aside to accommodate James's needs and expectations. While I was rebuilding my personal life, Richard was experiencing the consequences of his choices. Without my institutional knowledge and systems, the accounting firm began to struggle. Longtime clients like Martin Weber transferred their business elsewhere, some explicitly citing ethical concerns about how I'd been treated. The firm's reputation, built over decades on personal relationships and trust, suffered damage that Richard's technical skills couldn't repair. "He's been calling clients offering discounted services to win them back," Martin reported during one of our occasional lunch meetings. "But people remember how you treated them like family, remembered their children's names and asked about their vacations. That kind of connection isn't replaced with a fee reduction." I took no pleasure in the business difficulties, but neither did I feel responsible for them. Richard had made his choice, valuing property and control over family bonds and ethical business practices. The natural consequences of those choices belonged to him alone. 6 months after moving into my new home, I received an unexpected call from my daughter Jennifer. Unlike Richard, who had lived locally and worked in the family business, Jennifer had moved to Colorado after college, maintaining minimal contact with James and me. I had always assumed she simply preferred distance from her family, but our conversation revealed a different story. "Dad told me you didn't want me to visit," she said hesitantly, "that you were disappointed in my career choices and lifestyle. He showed me letters you supposedly wrote." The revelation stunned me. "Jennifer, I never wrote any such letters. I've missed you terribly all these years." The silence on the line stretched, heavy with decades of manufactured separation. "I thought it was strange," she finally said. "It didn't sound like you. But Dad was so convincing." We talked for hours that first call, beginning the slow process of untangling James's web of manipulations and rebuilding our relationship. I learned that she'd tried to call me numerous times over the years, but James had intercepted the calls, telling her I was too busy, or not feeling well, or simply not interested in talking. She'd married, had 2 children I'd never met, divorced, built a successful career as an environmental consultant. An entire life lived while I remained trapped in James's carefully constructed isolation. "I'd like to visit," she said tentatively. "Meet in person after all this time. See your new home." "I'd like that very much," I replied, tears flowing freely. "Very much indeed." Jennifer's visit a month later was both healing and painful, highlighting how much we'd lost to James's controlling tactics. Her children, my grandchildren, were teenagers now, nearly adults themselves, strangers to me despite our shared blood. But they were open to connection, curious about this grandmother who had suddenly appeared in their lives. "Mom always said there was more to the story," explained Alex, my 16-year-old grandson. "She never believed you just didn't care." Jennifer stayed for a week, helping me finish painting the kitchen and plan an expansion of the garden. We established a rhythm of weekly phone calls after she returned to Colorado, slowly rebuilding the mother-daughter relationship that James had systematically undermined. She shared photographs and stories of the children's younger years, helping me piece together the family history I'd been denied. As my personal life flourished, I found unexpected professional fulfillment as well. The library increased my hours to full-time, offering benefits and a small promotion to reference assistant. The bookkeeping skills I developed during my years at Patterson Accounting proved valuable for library budget management, and my newly acquired computer proficiency allowed me to help patrons navigate digital resources. I also began offering informal bookkeeping services to small local businesses, particularly women-owned enterprises that needed affordable financial management. What started as occasional help for Gloria's friends grew into a steady side business, providing both additional income and the satisfaction of using my skills to support others building their dreams. "You should get certified," suggested Gloria after I helped her reorganize her bookkeeping system. "Make it official." The idea of formal education at 70 seemed absurd at first, but the community college offered an accounting certificate program designed for working adults. With evening classes and my employee discount at the library, the program was both accessible and affordable. "I'm old enough to be everyone's grandmother," I laughed to Susan when describing my first class. "But they treat me like any other student. It's refreshing." Nearly 18 months after that devastating day when Richard abandoned me on a rural road, I received a letter from him. The envelope sat unopened on my counter for 3 days while I considered whether to read it at all. My life had found its rhythm without him, a peaceful existence built on genuine connections and personal growth. Did I want to invite his presence back in any form? Curiosity finally won. The letter was brief, formal, almost clinical in its language. Richard explained that the business was struggling, that several key clients had left, that systems I had implemented were proving difficult to maintain without my knowledge. He proposed a consulting arrangement, suggesting I might advise on administrative processes for a fee. No apology, no acknowledgement of the harm done. Just a business proposition from someone who had thrown me away when I seemed to have no value, now cautiously suggesting I might be useful again. I composed several responses, each angrier than the last, before settling on a simple, direct reply. "Thank you for your inquiry," I wrote. "I am not available for consulting work with Patterson Accounting. I wish you well in your business endeavors." Not a door slammed shut, not a bridge burned, but a boundary clearly established. I was no longer available to be used when convenient, and discarded when not. My time, my knowledge, my very self had value that I now recognized, even if Richard did not. 2 years to the day after James's funeral, I hosted a gathering in my garden. Jennifer and her children visited from Colorado. Susan and Martha, my first supporters when I had nothing, brought homemade dishes. Gloria and the women from our art group came with small gifts and warm hugs. Diane, whose legal expertise had secured my new beginning, arrived with a bottle of champagne. "A celebration of your second act," she toasted, raising her glass as we all gathered on the patio I'd built with Ted's guidance. At 70, I had created a life I could never have imagined during my decades with James. A home that reflected my tastes and interests. Work that utilized my skills and brought me satisfaction. Friendships based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Family connections rebuilt on honesty and choice rather than manipulation and control. The journey had begun with devastating betrayal and abandonment, but had led to a liberation I might never have found otherwise. The painful gift of that roadside desertion was the opportunity to discover my own strength, to build an authentic life aligned with my values, rather than someone else's expectations. I began speaking occasionally at women's groups about financial independence and late life transitions. Not as an expert, but as a fellow traveler who had found her way through particularly difficult terrain. The questions were always similar regardless of the audience age. Weren't you terrified to start over at your age? How did you find the courage to fight back? Isn't it lonely being on your own after so many years of marriage? My answers evolved over time, but the core remained consistent. Yes, I was terrified, but fear and action can coexist. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. And being alone by choice is fundamentally different from being lonely within a relationship that denies your essential self. The day my son abandoned me on that remote road was the day my real life finally began. I often concluded these talks, not because abandonment is a gift, but because sometimes our greatest challenges reveal strengths we never knew we possessed. Each morning now, I wake in a home that reflects my choices. I tend a garden I designed. I work at jobs that value my contributions. I maintain relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. In the evening, I often sit in my favorite chair by the bay window, watching the light change as day transitions to night, and practice a simple gratitude ritual. Thank you for my home. Thank you for my health. Thank you for my friends. Thank you for my newfound family connections. Thank you for the strength I didn't know I had. Thank you for the chance to finally become Eleanor. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to something positive in your life? Or have you had to start over when you least expected it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if my journey has resonated with you in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to begin again. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes what feels like an ending is really just the first step toward becoming who you were always meant to be.